Today, we're going to take a slightly different approach. We are going to be fully deconstructing the sound of a snare drum so that you can learn how to analyze the sound for yourself and have better access to the sounds that you're looking for. Let's dive right into the sound of this drum. We're obscuring exactly what it is, not to hide anything, but instead to give you an opportunity to focus on just listening without any judgment based on what you would see. Let's start with a real eagle's eye view of what this sounds like. We want to identify exactly the constituent parts of the sound that we can hear at this point so we can start to get an idea of what we're hearing as a whole. Rather than tell you what to look for, our goal here is to allow you the opportunity to listen and start to find the aspects of the sound of this drum as we move through these demos. For instance, do you feel like you hear that there's muffling on this drum? Or not? Does it sound to you like it's tuned very high or very low? Are you feeling like you're hearing the presence of a lot of overtones or not a lot of overtones? What is your perception of the sustain of the drum, the length of the note, the way that it decays after being struck, particularly in the rim shot? These are all facets of how it's tuned predominantly. They don't have a whole lot to do with what the actual drum itself is or the construction thereof. What that means for us is as we start to be able to identify these aspects, we can utilize them as ingredients when we go to our own drums and start to go after a sound that we're looking for. Now that we've identified a few things that we can specifically listen for, let's listen to those same demos again and see if we can get into exactly what those things are doing. Now that we've had a chance to analyze those performances one more time, take a breath, think about them for a second, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you what the drum is that we're using today. It's a superphonic, but it's important to note that that is not the dominant factor in the sound that we're using. These facets will be present in any snare drum that you have, and you can use all of these exercises at home as well. Let's dive one step further and get into some lower dynamics where we're going to start to really hear more of the sustain, more of the wires, and how all of these things are interacting. What are we hearing now that we're getting down very close to the drum and not digging in quite so aggressively? There's a lot more interaction with the wires, but what is that nature? Is it sustainy? Is it sharp? Is it staccato? Is it messy? It could be any of those things, but we need to listen really closely to understand exactly how the heads and the wires are interacting. Let's give the roll another listen. I'm hearing that this roll is very, very broad at the edge of the drum and becomes tighter and clearer at the center of the drum, both in the press roll portion and in the open roll section. Now let's check out the dynamics from the edge to the center again. This speaks to the same thing as the rolls. We have broader, more sustainy sounds in the wires at the edge, and it becomes very staccato in the center and super clear. It's worth noting that earlier when we were striking the drum a lot harder, it wasn't choking out under that velocity, which also tells us that the snare wires are not overly tightened at this point, and also neither of the heads are extremely high tension either. There is a facet of the snare wires that we do need to talk about at this juncture, and it has to do with the degree to which they muffle the sound of the drum. Anytime we press material into either of the drum heads, we're changing their capacity to resonate, and that goes for the wires as much as anything else. Let's move on away from the sound of this as a snare drum and turn the wires off to treat it more like a tom and see what we can learn from that. Now that we've removed what muffling there is, which is the snare wires, there's a lot more clarity of the tone in the center of the drum, and we can get a much clearer idea of the pitch range of it. We can actually hear the pitch. We can also hear much more clearly the intonation of the drum, and specifically if there's any part of the drum that is more or less in tune with itself. If either of the heads on this drum were out of tune with itself, you would hear a wobble in the sustain and decay of the sound, almost like going in and out of phase with itself. Sometimes having the wires engaged can make this sound more or less present, so when we're tuning the drum or adjusting anything, it's worth checking both with the wires on and off to make sure you know what you're hearing. Let's listen to this drum from the edge to the center, similarly to how we did in the previous demos with the wires on. The sustain is present in a very similar way to the way it was when the wires were engaged. However, now we can really hear the tone of that sustain because it's not obscured by the presence of the wires. This can give us a lot of information about the range that the drum is tuned in and also its capacity to resonate when we strike it. If, for instance, the batter or the snare side head were over-tensioned, we might hear an extreme amount of sustain or a really diminished amount of sustain, depending on which way it's tuned. Now that we've really put this drum under the microscope, let's back away, put it in the context of a groove, and see how everything that we've learned about its sound sits in the context of the rest of the kit. As a listener, are we hearing all of that audio information that we had before? Are we hearing all of the sustain and the overtones? Or perhaps are some of them being swallowed up by the high end of the hi-hat or the low end of the bass drum when we hear it? This effect is only compounded if there's any other instruments playing along with us, drums, bass, guitar, literally anything that's occupying a similar frequency range. This is part of the reason why we talk an awful lot about being very judicious about adjustments of your drums and also muffling or any other additions you might make, because in a vacuum like this, there's everything in front of us from the sound of the drum. And as we start to add other things around it, be it more drums or more musicians, all of that changes. Let's hear this drum in context a little bit more. All of the listening that we're practicing today becomes a little bit of a different game when we start to listen to drums that are in the context of a completed track by a band we like or something that we're working on, or anything in between. It's hard to remember that when we want to have our drums sound a certain kind of way based on something that was inspirational for us, unless we heard that drum in person with nothing else around, it is definitely being affected by 1 or 10 or a million reasons that get in the way of us knowing what the true sound is. Now, if that sounds a little discouraging, don't worry, because if what we love is the sound that we're hearing in that context, we can still go after that. It'll just be a little bit different than perhaps what that player heard in the room when they were tracking. The bottom line goal for all of this is to be able to take a breath when you hear a sound that makes you happy, or even a sound that's in your head that you're imagining, and start to take apart the constituent aspects of it so that you can not get bogged down by being overwhelmed by trying to make a sound that's challenging. Understanding the interaction between the heads, the wires, the context that you're playing in, all of these things, the tuning more so than anything else, gives us the opportunity to be able to understand these things and get the sound we're after quickly and not end up worrying about it or spending all day fussing with the instrument. Taking these critical listening skills and applying them to tuning and as much experience as you can garner for yourself with your own drums can actually get you to the point where when you listen to an album that you like or hear a song for the first time, you'll be able to picture how the sound was generated that you're hearing. It's like being able to see the matrix or something like that. It's an ability that is not born into anybody. It's purely from experience, and particularly choosing to hone these skills and utilize them regularly so they become a part of your musicianship and your daily life. We encourage you to take this practice into your daily life, and also make sure that you step outside of your comfort zone and try it out with sounds that aren't your favorite, music that your friends like that maybe you don't like. Broaden your horizons, because all of that experience will only serve to improve you. If this seems like kind of a head game and like it's not really a big part of music or playing drums, you couldn't be further from the truth. This is exactly how we exercise critical listening skills here at the studio and professionally playing music to be able to understand the sound of our instrument. The more experience you have using your critical listening skills and honing them, the better off you're going to be as a musician, not just as a drummer or a tuner of drums, but also in terms of appreciating the music that you're making, the other musicians you might play with, or even just your favorite records. The more you know, the more you can enjoy it.